1983, on a quiet stretch of road that most people passed without a second glance, a single choice made by one ordinary woman set off a chain of events that would sleep silently for 25 long years, only to awaken at the exact moment her life needed it most. She didn't know their names. She didn't know their stories. All she saw was a broken van, 4 tired veterans, and a decision that had to be made in the space of a heartbeat. She could keep driving, tell herself it wasn't her problem, and go home to the safety of routine, or she could stop. What she did that day never made the news. There were no cameras, no applause, no medals handed out. And yet, decades later, that forgotten act of kindness would come back in a way she could never have imagined, carried by 4 men who had never forgotten her. Welcome to Swift Tale, a channel where true moments of humanity remind us that the smallest actions can echo across a lifetime. If this is your first time visiting Swift Tale, let me ask you something. Do you believe one simple decision can change multiple lives forever? And if stories like that matter to you, would you consider liking, sharing, and subscribing so you never miss another unforgettable tale? Here, we don't just tell stories. We uncover the hidden threads that connect people across years, across hardship, and across hope. This story begins in an America that felt very different from today. It was 1983, a time when payphones still lined street corners, handwritten letters carried news across states, and strangers were often just that, strangers. For this woman, life wasn't easy. She wasn't wealthy or powerful. She wasn't someone people wrote songs about. She worked hard, worried often, and carried her own quiet burdens. And yet on that day, when fate placed 4 veterans in her path, men worn down by service, by circumstance, and by a broken-down van, she chose compassion over convenience. She chose to help when no one would have blamed her for walking away. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than a brief interruption to her day, a repair made, a few words exchanged, a goodbye spoken without ceremony. The 4 men drove off, their van sputtering back to life, disappearing down the road and out of her world. She never expected to see them again. Life moved on as it always does. Years passed, seasons changed, dreams faded, new worries took their place, and the memory of that day slowly softened at the edges. To her, it became just another story tucked away in the back of the mind, a reminder that she once did the right thing when it mattered. But kindness, as it turns out, keeps its own memory. For the 4 veterans, that moment in 1983 never truly faded. Each of them carried it differently. For one, it was proof that not everyone had forgotten them after they returned home. For another, it was a reminder that help can come from the most unexpected places. For all of them, it became a symbol, a small light during a dark chapter of their lives. As the years went by, they built families, careers, and futures shaped by both the scars of their service and the strength they found in survival. And somewhere along the way, a quiet promise took root between them. If they ever had the chance, they would find her again. This story matters because it challenges the way we measure impact. We're often told that changing lives requires money, status, or influence. But this tale proves something far more powerful, that compassion offered at the right moment can outlast time itself. It shows us how gratitude can mature, how memory can become motivation, and how the past has a way of returning when we least expect it. It's a story about veterans who refused to forget, and a woman who never realized how much she meant to them. It's about how life, in its quiet wisdom, sometimes balances the scales when all hope seems lost. As we journey back to that roadside in 1983, you'll see how one broken van became the starting point for a bond that stretched across 25 years. You'll witness the struggles faced by both sides of this story, the woman who gave help without expecting anything in return, and the men who carried her kindness through decades of challenge and change. And when the past finally collides with the present, you'll understand why this reunion didn't just bring tears, it changed a life forever. So settle in, because this isn't just a story about the past. It's a reminder for today, a reminder that the smallest choices can plant seeds we may never see grow, and that sometimes, long after we think a moment is gone, it finds its way back to us, stronger, deeper, and more meaningful than ever before. The year was 1983, and America moved at a slower, heavier pace, carrying both the optimism of recovery and the quiet weight of uncertainty. Gas prices still mattered deeply to working families, small towns clung to their routines, and news traveled more by word of mouth than by screens. There were no smartphones to distract from the world, no GPS to guide stranded travelers, and no social media to turn private moments into public spectacles. Life unfolded face to face, problem by problem, and people often relied on neighbors or complete strangers when things went wrong. In these towns, character was measured not by what someone owned, but by how they showed up when it counted. The woman at the center of this story lived a life that would never be called remarkable by most standards, yet it was built on strength most people never noticed. She woke early, worked long hours, and stretched every dollar as far as it would go. Her hands were rough from labor, her back ached more often than she admitted, and her dreams had slowly shifted from ambition to survival. She wasn't bitter, but she wasn't naive either. Life had taught her that help didn't come easily, and when it did, it often carried a price. Still, she believed in doing right by others, not because she expected reward, but because it was how she had been raised. Her days followed a rhythm shaped by responsibility. Morning routines were quiet and efficient. Coffee brewed while she planned the day ahead, bills to pay, errands to run, work to complete. There was little room for rest and even less for indulgence. She lived modestly, not because she lacked imagination, but because circumstances had narrowed her options. Yet despite everything, there was a gentleness in her spirit that hardship had not erased. She smiled easily, listened carefully, and when someone needed help, her first instinct was to consider how, not whether, she could give it. Around her, the town carried its own stories. Old storefronts stood beside newer ones, veterans gathered at diners nursing coffee and memories, and highways cut through the landscape like veins, carrying people who rarely stopped. Many were just passing through, chasing jobs, running from problems, or searching for something they couldn't name. Broken-down vehicles were not uncommon, especially on long stretches of road where help was miles away. Most drivers slowed briefly, looked, and kept moving, not out of cruelty, but caution. Times were tough, and trust came slowly. The lingering shadow of war was still present in 1983. Veterans walked among civilians, often unnoticed, carrying experiences they didn't talk about and burdens they didn't share. Some had adjusted. Others were still fighting battles no one could see. Society thanked them in words, but often failed them in practice. Jobs were scarce, support uneven, and understanding limited. For many veterans, the road itself became a metaphor for life, unpredictable, exhausting, and prone to sudden breakdowns. On the day everything began, the woman was not expecting anything unusual. There was no sense of destiny in the air, no warning that her routine would be interrupted. She had places to be, worries of her own, and little margin for delay. It would have been easy, reasonable, even to ignore anything that threatened her schedule. And yet, something about that day felt quietly charged, as if the world were holding its breath without announcing why. What makes this moment so powerful is how ordinary it was. No dramatic music played. No voice whispered that history was about to be made. Just a woman, a road, and a life shaped by years of perseverance. In 1983, she had no idea that the values guiding her choices, kindness, responsibility, empathy, were about to be tested in a way that would ripple far beyond that single afternoon. She believed she was simply living her life, doing her best, and moving forward one day at a time. But sometimes, the most important moments arrive disguised as inconveniences. Sometimes, history doesn't knock loudly, it waits patiently by the roadside, hoping someone will stop. The van came to a stop with a final cough of smoke and metal fatigue, rolling just far enough onto the gravel shoulder before surrendering completely. It wasn't dramatic, no explosion, no sudden skid, just the slow, humiliating realization that the engine was done. For the four men inside, that quiet failure felt heavier than it should have. They had been on the road for hours, the miles blurring together beneath tires already worn thin, and now they were stranded on a stretch of highway that offered more silence than help. The sun hung high, the air shimmered with heat, and the road stretched endlessly in both directions, indifferent to their situation. These weren't reckless young men chasing adventure. They were veterans, each carrying years of service behind them and uncertainty ahead. Their uniforms were long gone, replaced by practical clothes and tired boots, but the posture remained, the alertness, the habit of scanning the horizon. War had trained them to expect trouble, yet nothing in their experience prepared them for how helpless a broken-down vehicle could make a person feel. A van was supposed to be freedom, movement, progress, escape. Now it was a metal cage, holding them in place. They climbed out one by one, lifting the hood in a gesture that was half hope, half habit. Steam hissed softly, and the smell of overheated oil filled the air. One of them muttered a quiet curse, another wiped his hands on his jeans before even touching anything, already knowing it wouldn't help. They weren't mechanics. They were men used to following orders, solving problems under pressure, adapting quickly, but machines didn't respond to willpower. The engine didn't care about discipline or courage. It was broken, and that was that. Traffic passed in brief, indifferent bursts. Cars slowed just enough for drivers to look, then sped up again, disappearing down the road. Each passing vehicle carried a silent question, should I stop? And with it an unspoken answer, someone else will. The veterans watched this happen again and again, the rhythm becoming almost predictable. A glance, a hesitation, then nothing. They didn't blame anyone. They understood caution. Still, every car that didn't stop made the road feel lonelier. Their situation was precarious. Money was tight. Time was tighter. They were traveling with purpose. Each mile mattered. Each delay compounded the stress already sitting heavy in their chests. A tow truck would cost more than they could afford. A mechanic might as well have been on another planet. Cell phones were not an option, and the nearest payphone was miles away. The van wasn't just transportation, it was their lifeline. Without it, plans unraveled, and the future narrowed into uncomfortable possibilities. Despite the frustration, there was a quiet bond among them. Shared glances said what words didn't need to. They had relied on each other in far worse circumstances than this, and that history created a steady undercurrent of trust. Jokes were cracked, not because the situation was funny, but because humor had always been their shield. One of them suggested they'd offended the mechanical gods. Another said the van had simply decided it had gone far enough. Laughter came briefly, then faded, leaving the sound of wind and distant traffic behind. As minutes stretched into an hour, the heat wore them down. Sweat darkened their shirts, and fatigue crept into their movements. The road offered no shade, no comfort, and no assurance that help would come. They stood there exposed, not just to the sun, but to the vulnerability of being seen as stranded, dependent, and forgotten. For men who had once worn uniforms that commanded respect, the contrast was sharp and quietly painful. They had no way of knowing that, at that very moment, their lives were about to intersect with someone whose presence would change the meaning of that day forever. To them, this was just another obstacle, another test of patience and endurance. The van sat silently, hood open like a wound, while the road waited. And somewhere in the distance, a car was approaching, one driven by a woman who had no idea she was about to step into a story that would follow all of them for the next 25 years. She noticed the van before she noticed the men. It sat awkwardly on the shoulder of the road, hood raised like a silent signal of distress, its faded paint dulled further by dust and sun. At first, she did what most people did. She slowed slightly, glanced over, and considered continuing on her way. Her day was already full. She was tired. And in 1983, stopping for strangers wasn't something people did lightly, especially when those strangers were four grown men standing beside a broken vehicle. Caution wasn't just sensible, it was survival. As she passed them, something tugged at her attention. Maybe it was the way they stood, close together, but not aggressive, weary rather than threatening. Maybe it was the look of quiet defeat in their movements, the kind that comes from having exhausted every option. Or maybe it was simply the way her conscience refused to let the moment slide by. She drove another 100 yards before pulling over, her heart beating faster as she sat gripping the steering wheel, debating with herself. She could still leave. No one would know, no one would judge her, but the image of that van stayed fixed in her mind. When she finally turned back, dust kicked up behind her tires, and one of the men noticed her approach. His body tensed, not in fear, but in readiness, years of training rising automatically to the surface. She stepped out slowly, keeping her distance, offering a cautious smile that carried both kindness and self-protection. "Everything okay?" she called out, her voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in her chest. It was a simple question, but it bridged a gap that had been filled with uncertainty just moments before. The men exchanged glances before one of them answered. He explained the situation plainly: engine trouble, No money for a tow, no idea how long they'd be stuck. There was no begging in his tone, no expectation that she could fix anything, just honesty. Up close, she could see their fatigue etched into their faces, the kind that went deeper than a long day on the road. These weren't drifters or troublemakers. These were men who had been worn down by circumstances, by years of carrying weight most people never saw. She introduced herself, and they followed suit, first names only, nothing more. The conversation was careful at first, both sides testing the ground. She asked where they were headed. They told her. She asked how long they'd been stranded. They shrugged long enough to stop counting. As they talked, tension slowly gave way to something softer. The distance between them shrank, not physically but emotionally. Suspicion didn't vanish, but it loosened its grip. There was an unspoken moment when all five of them understood the imbalance of the situation. She was alone, they were four, and yet somehow the power didn't sit where one might expect. These men, shaped by discipline and service, treated her with a respect that felt deliberate, almost protective. Their words were measured, their movements restrained. They didn't crowd her or pressure her. Instead, they waited, allowing her the space to decide how involved she wanted to be. As the conversation continued, she learned they were veterans. The word changed the air between them. It explained the quiet bond she sensed among them, the way they communicated without speaking, the depth behind their tired eyes. It also stirred something in her, a mix of respect and sadness. She knew, as many did, that coming home from service didn't always mean coming home to support. Seeing them there, stranded and overlooked, felt wrong in a way she couldn't ignore. She looked at the van again, then back at the men, weighing her options. She couldn't fix everything. She didn't have much money. She wasn't a hero, but she could do something. And as that realization settled in, the story shifted, subtly but irrevocably. This was no longer just a chance encounter on the side of the road. It was the moment where hesitation gave way to choice, and where five strangers began crossing the invisible line between "not my problem" and "I'll help if I can." None of them knew it yet, but this first conversation, awkward, cautious, and ordinary, was laying the foundation for a connection that time itself would struggle to break. After a long moment of silence, she spoke again, her voice quieter now but steadier, as if a decision had finally settled in her chest. She asked what exactly was wrong with the van. The men exchanged another look, part surprise, part hesitation, before admitting they weren't entirely sure. The engine had overheated, something had rattled loose, and then everything had gone dead. They'd tried what they could, but guessing only made things worse. She nodded, listening carefully, not because she understood engines any better than they did, but because listening itself felt like a form of help. She walked around the van, peering under the hood, squinting against the sun. Grease and dust coated the engine like a stubborn film, and the smell of burnt oil lingered in the air. She didn't pretend to be a mechanic. Instead, she thought practically. There was a small garage a few miles back, run by an older man who still believed in fixing things rather than replacing them. She, grown up around engines enough to know when something was beyond a quick roadside solution. The question wasn't whether the van could be fixed, it was how to get it there without money or tools. Without fanfare, she offered what she could. She said she'd drive back to town, talk to the mechanic, and see if he'd be willing to come take a look or allow the van to be towed on credit. The men tried to refuse at first. They didn't want to be a burden. Pride, hardened by years of self-reliance, made accepting help difficult, but she cut through their hesitation with calm certainty. "Let me at least ask," she said. "No harm in that." It wasn't a grand promise, just an honest one. True to her word, she left them there, turning her car around and heading back the way she'd come. For the veterans, watching her drive off was strangely unsettling. They'd seen kindness offered before and withdrawn just as quickly. Hope could be dangerous. Still, something about her confidence, the way she hadn't over-explained or dramatized the situation, made them believe she might actually return. They waited, sitting on the guardrail, standing in the shade cast by the open hood, watching the road with cautious expectation. When she came back, she wasn't alone. The mechanic followed in his truck, curiosity written all over his face. She had spoken plainly to him, explained who the men were, and quietly insisted on covering what she could. She didn't have much, but she was willing to put her own money down without asking for guarantees. The mechanic, moved more by her resolve than the cash itself, agreed to help. The van was towed back, and for the first time that day, the road released its grip on them. The repair took longer than expected. The problem was worse than a loose hose or overheated engine. Parts were worn, connections fragile. The mechanic shook his head more than once, but he kept working. Throughout it all she stayed. She could have left once the help was arranged, but she didn't. She sat on an overturned crate, shared water, and talked with the men as if they were old acquaintances rather than strangers she'd met hours earlier. There was no judgment in her questions, no pity in her tone, just genuine interest. When the van finally roared back to life, the relief was almost physical. One of the men laughed out loud, another closed his eyes briefly as if offering silent thanks. They reached for their wallets, knowing there wasn't enough there to cover what had been done, and she stopped them gently. She paid the balance without making a show of it, ignoring their protests. "You can get someone else someday," she said, brushing off their gratitude as if it were unnecessary. To her, this wasn't charity, it was simply doing what felt right. They stood in the fading light as the moment of departure approached. Words felt inadequate. Thank you didn't seem big enough. Promises of repayment felt hollow. One of them asked for her address, another suggested they stay in touch, but life in 1983 didn't make those things easy. She smiled, waved away the idea, and told them to take care of themselves. As they drove off, the van humming steadily now, she watched until it disappeared from view, then turned back toward her own life, never imagining that what she had just given would be remembered for decades. To her, it was a long day and an unexpected expense. To them, it was proof that kindness still existed when they needed it most. And in that quiet exchange, help given without conditions, gratitude carried without words, the future was quietly rewritten. The road swallowed the van slowly, its shape growing smaller until it became nothing more than a shimmer against the horizon. The sound of the engine faded, replaced by the familiar quiet of the town settling back into its rhythm. She stood there for a moment longer than necessary, as if waiting for something else to happen, some final signal that the day had truly ended. Then she exhaled, turned, and went back to her car. There was dinner to make, work to prepare for, and bills waiting at home. Life, indifferent to meaning, resumed exactly where it had left off. On the drive back, she replayed the events in her mind, not with pride, but with a strange sense of disbelief. She hadn't planned to help four strangers. She hadn't budgeted for the money she'd spent. It would make the coming weeks tighter, more uncomfortable. Yet beneath the practical worry was a quiet peace. She had done what she could, and that had to be enough. Whatever happened next was out of her hands. She didn't expect a thank you letter. She didn't expect repayment. In truth, she didn't expect to ever think about them again. Memories have a way of lingering, especially when they form around moments of moral clarity. In the days that followed, small reminders surfaced: a van passing on the highway, the smell of oil at the garage, a scrap of conversation overheard at a diner. Each one brought a fleeting image of four tired men on the side of the road. She would pause just briefly, then move on. Life demanded attention, and sentiment didn't pay rent. The moment quietly folded itself into the fabric of her past. For the veterans, leaving that town was harder than they admitted. The road stretched ahead of them, familiar yet altered by what had just occurred. The van felt different now, not just because it worked, but because of what it represented. As they drove, conversation drifted back to the woman who had stopped when no one else had. They talked about her matter-of-fact kindness, her refusal to be thanked, the way she treated them like people rather than problems. Each of them carried that memory differently, but all of them carried it deeply. They returned to their journey with renewed resolve. Something about that encounter had restored a piece of faith they didn't realize they'd lost. It reminded them that service hadn't made them invisible, that compassion still existed beyond slogans and ceremonies. One of them said quietly that if he ever got the chance, he'd repay her somehow. Another nodded, though none of them knew how or when such a thing could happen. It was a promise made not in certainty, but in hope. Time, however, is rarely kind to intentions. Days turned into months, months into years. The veterans' lives diverged, shaped by opportunity, struggle, and survival. They moved, married, worked, and endured. Addresses changed. Phone numbers were lost. The woman's name stayed with them, but the details blurred around the edges. Still, the story never disappeared. It resurfaced during late-night conversations, in moments of doubt, and whenever one of them needed reminding that decency could appear without warning. Meanwhile, she continued forward, unaware of the quiet legacy she'd created. Her life offered no immediate reward for her kindness. There were no sudden turns of fortune, no doors flung open by fate. Challenges persisted. Some grew heavier with time. And as the years passed, that afternoon in 1983 became just one of many memories, significant perhaps, but distant. She had no way of knowing that four men were carrying her generosity through decades of their lives, or that somewhere in the future, those memories were gathering weight. They had parted ways without ceremony, without promises binding them together. And yet, unseen threads had been woven that day, threads of gratitude, resilience, and unfinished purpose. The road had separated them, but time had not erased what was shared. It had only hidden it, waiting patiently for the moment when past and present would collide once more. Time moved forward the way it always does, quietly, relentlessly, without regard for memory or meaning. For her, the years after 1983 were not marked by dramatic shifts, but by the steady accumulation of ordinary struggles. Work remained demanding and uncertain. Jobs came and went, each promising stability and delivering only enough to get by. She learned to live with less, to stretch patience the way she stretched dollars, and to accept disappointment without letting it harden her. Life didn't break her, but it wore her down in ways only endurance can. The small town changed gradually around her. Businesses closed, others replaced them. Familiar faces disappeared, some moving away, others leaving for reasons that didn't require explanation. The world seemed to speed up while her own life stayed rooted in routine. Technology advanced, opportunities shifted, and the gap between effort and reward often felt wider than ever. She watched others move ahead while she stayed where she was, not because she lacked ability, but because life had placed limits she couldn't outrun. Loss, when it came, did not ask permission. People she loved faded from her life through distance, misunderstanding, and death. Each absence carved a quiet space she learned to live around. She didn't speak much about her loneliness, not because she didn't feel it, but because she didn't want to burden anyone else. Strength had become her default setting. Asking for help felt unnatural, almost indulgent. After all, she had learned long ago that you survive by handling things yourself. And yet, despite everything, her compassion never disappeared. She continued helping where she could, small gestures, quiet kindnesses, nothing that would draw attention. A meal shared, a ride offered, a listening ear when someone needed to talk. She never framed these actions as virtues. They were simply part of who she was. Still, there were moments, late at night, when worries pressed heavily, that she wondered whether kindness really mattered in a world that seemed to reward something else entirely. Years passed. The memory of the four veterans softened, resurfacing only occasionally, like an old photograph found in the back of a drawer. She would remember their faces, the gratitude in their voices, and wonder briefly where life had taken them. Then the thought would pass. The future demanded focus, and nostalgia did not pay the bills. She grew older, her body slower, her resilience tested by time. Dreams that once felt possible narrowed into hopes that felt more realistic. Security, peace, a little rest. As the calendar pages turned, circumstances grew heavier. Work became harder to find. Health concerns crept in quietly, disguised as fatigue and aches she ignored for too long. She adapted as she always had, adjusting expectations rather than asking for miracles. Independence remained her pride, even when it came at a cost. To the outside world, she appeared steady, capable, unremarkable. Few people knew how much effort it took just to maintain that appearance. What she couldn't see was how time was working elsewhere. While her life seemed to circle the same challenges, the past was quietly reorganizing itself. Decisions made decades earlier were gaining clarity and purpose in the minds of others. The kindness she had given without thought was maturing, deepening, and waiting. She believed that day in 1983 had ended when the van disappeared down the road. She believed it belonged to the past. But some moments refuse to stay where we leave them. As the years rolled on, that roadside encounter became something larger than memory. It became a promise, unspoken, unfinished, and patient. And while she faced the weight of time alone, the story she thought was over was slowly, deliberately preparing to return. After they drove away from that town in 1983, life did not suddenly become easy for the four veterans. The road carried them forward, but it did not smooth itself out. Each man returned to a different version of reality, one shaped by opportunity, limitation, and the lingering effects of service that never fully released its grip. They scattered across states and cities, chasing work, stability, and a sense of belonging that often felt just out of reach. Yet no matter how far they traveled, the memory of that day stayed with them, carried like a shared secret. One of them struggled for years to find steady footing. Jobs came and went, and the transition from military structure to civilian uncertainty left him restless and frustrated. Nights were the hardest. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by memories he rarely spoke about. But whenever doubt crept in, he remembered the woman who had stopped when no one else would. Her kindness became a quiet reminder that not every chapter of his life had been defined by loss. Sometimes, goodness arrived without warning. Another veteran managed to build a career, though not without sacrifice. He worked relentlessly, driven by the need to prove to employers, to family, and to himself that he was more than what he had seen and survived. He carried responsibility heavily, often putting others first, just as she had done for them. When success finally came, it didn't erase the past, but it softened it. And in moments of reflection, he traced his determination back to that roadside encounter, a moment that reminded him he was worth helping. For the third, family became both anchor and challenge. He married, raised children, and tried to create the stability he'd once lacked. Yet the emotional distance forged by service followed him home, showing up in silences and misunderstandings. In those moments, he thought of the woman's patience, the way she listened without judgment, helped without condition. She had given him a model of quiet strength, and he returned to it whenever he felt himself drifting away from the person he wanted to be. The fourth veteran carried the memory differently. He became the storyteller among them, the one who reminded the others of where they'd come from. Over beers, at reunions, or during long phone calls, he would bring up the broken van and the woman who changed their day and maybe their lives. To him, that moment symbolized something larger than help. It was proof that the world hadn't given up on them, even when they'd nearly given up on themselves. As years passed, the story of that day became a bond that held them together despite distance. They lost touch at times, reconnected, drifted again, but whenever life pressed hard, that memory resurfaced, anchoring them to something good and uncorrupted by time. They wondered about her, how she was doing, whether life had been kind to her, whether she remembered them at all. None of them could shake the feeling that the debt they owed was unfinished. With time came perspective. They began to understand that what she'd given them wasn't just mechanical help or money. It was dignity. It was the feeling of being seen when they were stranded, overlooked, and vulnerable. That realization grew heavier as they aged, especially as they themselves began to help others, sometimes consciously modeling her example, other times realizing only afterward where the impulse had come from. Eventually, the question stopped being if they should find her and became when. Life had given them experience, resources, and clarity they didn't have in 1983. Gratitude matured into responsibility. The kindness that once saved their journey now demanded acknowledgement. And as the years stacked higher, the idea of returning, of closing the circle, shifted from wishful thought to quiet determination. The idea of finding her again didn't arrive all at once. It surfaced gradually, in fragments, during late-night conversations, chance reunions, and moments when life slowed just enough for reflection to take hold. One of them mentioned her name in passing, wondering aloud what had become of the woman who helped them when they had nothing. Another admitted he still thought about that day whenever he saw a stranded car on the roadside. What began as nostalgia slowly hardened into purpose. By then, time had changed them. They were older, steadier, shaped by decades of living with the consequences of both good and bad decisions. Life had not been perfect, but it had given them perspective, and in different ways, the means to do more than they once could. They realized something that had been easy to overlook when they were younger. Gratitude loses its meaning if it's never acted upon. Remembering her was no longer enough. Reconnecting wasn't easy. Phone numbers were outdated. Addresses were forgotten. The town itself had changed names on storefronts and roads, but persistence had always been part of who they were. They dug through old records, made calls that led nowhere, and followed leads that fizzled out. Each setback tested their resolve, but none of them suggested giving up. If anything, the difficulty confirmed that this mattered. Some debts, they believed, were worth chasing across time. As they searched, they talked more openly about what that moment in 1983 had meant to each of them. For the first time, they acknowledged how close they'd been to losing hope that day and how her intervention had shifted something inside them. It wasn't just about the van. It was about being reminded that they still belonged in the world. Saying it out loud made the need to return even stronger. Eventually, a name led to a place, and a place led to a fragile sense of certainty. They learned that her life had not unfolded easily. There were hardships, losses, and years where survival took priority over comfort. Hearing this didn't discourage them, it deepened their resolve. The idea that she had helped them during one of their lowest moments while carrying her own burdens made their responsibility feel undeniable. They didn't plan a grand spectacle. This wasn't about public recognition or repayment measured in money alone. They wanted the return to be meaningful, respectful, and personal. They talked through every detail, what they would say, how they would explain the delay, whether she would even remember them. There was nervousness in those conversations, a rare vulnerability among men who had learned to face danger without flinching. The night before they left, sleep came slowly. Memories crowded in, heat rising from asphalt, the smell of oil, a woman standing beside a broken van with quiet resolve in her eyes. The past felt suddenly close, as if 25 years had folded in on themselves. When morning came, they packed the car with more than gifts or documents. They carried gratitude refined by time and the hope that returning kindness could still matter. As they set out, none of them knew how she would react, or whether the moment they envisioned would live up to the weight they had placed upon it. But certainty traveled with them. Some journeys are not about distance or destination. They are about finishing what was started long ago. When they finally arrived, there was no dramatic announcement, no crowd waiting, no sense that the world understood what was about to happen. The house was modest, the kind that blended quietly into the neighborhood, carrying the marks of time in its walls and windows. She answered the door without expectation, her expression polite but cautious, prepared for nothing more than another ordinary interruption. For a brief moment, none of them spoke. 25 years collapsed into silence as faces searched for recognition that had been softened by age and memory. Then one of them said her name. The sound of it stopped her cold. She looked at them more closely now, the familiar unfamiliarity of people once known only briefly, yet never fully forgotten. And when they spoke of the broken van, the roadside, and the day she had stopped when no one else would, understanding dawned slowly, like light spreading across a long dark room. Her hand rose to her mouth, disbelief giving way to emotion she had no words for. She hadn't imagined this moment because she had never believed it could happen. They told her everything, the years of remembering, the promise that had grown quietly between them, the decision to return. They thanked her not just for fixing a van, but for restoring something far more fragile at a time when they needed it most. Their voices wavered, unashamed. For men who had faced war and hardship, this was the bravest conversation they had ever had. And as they spoke, she realized something astonishing. That one ordinary afternoon she had nearly forgotten had lived on with purpose far beyond her understanding. What they gave her in return changed her life in ways she never expected. Help arrived where it was needed most, security, support, relief from burdens she had carried alone for years. But more than that, they gave her recognition. They gave her the undeniable proof that her kindness had mattered, that it had endured, that it had grown. The years she spent wondering whether compassion made any difference were answered in that single moment. Tears were shed freely, hers and theirs, because this reunion was not about charity or repayment. It was about balance, about life circling back to acknowledge a debt written not in money, but in humanity. She had helped without expecting anything. They returned not out of obligation, but gratitude refined by time. In that exchange, something healed in all of them. As they sat together, sharing stories and memories, laughter mixed with tears, and the past finally found its place. The woman who once believed she was invisible learned that she had been seen all along. The veterans who once felt abandoned learned that kindness could survive decades and still find its way home. It was not the ending any of them had imagined, but it was the one they all needed. Stories like this remind us that goodness does not expire, that a single choice, made quietly and without witnesses, can echo through decades and return when hope feels thinnest. If this story moved you, take a moment to let us know. Like the video, share it with someone who believes in the power of kindness, and subscribe to Swift Tale for more stories that prove humanity still matters. And don't forget to comment below What would you have done if you were standing on that roadside in 1983? In the days that followed the reunion, the emotional weight of what had happened settled in slowly, like dust after a long journey. For her, the house felt different, not because its walls had changed, but because something inside her had. Years of quiet endurance had taught her to expect little and accept less, yet now she found herself waking each morning with a feeling she hadn't known in decades: relief. Not just financial relief, though that mattered, but emotional release. The burden of feeling unseen, of wondering whether her sacrifices had any meaning, had finally lifted. She moved through her days with a softer heart. Ordinary moments carried new warmth, a phone call returned, a bill paid without anxiety, a memory revisited without regret. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to rest without guilt. The kindness she had offered so freely in the past had come back to her, not as obligation, but as affirmation. It reminded her that she had lived her life with integrity, even when no one was watching. For the veterans, the return brought its own transformation. The promise they had carried for 25 years no longer weighed on them, it completed them. There was peace in knowing they had honored something important, something that had shaped who they became. Regret loosened its grip, gratitude found expression, and with it came a quiet pride, not in themselves, but in having remembered when it would have been easier to forget. They stayed in touch after that day, not out of duty, but genuine connection. Calls were made, letters exchanged, holidays acknowledged. The woman who had once been a fleeting presence became part of their lives in a way none of them could have predicted. And in her, they saw a reflection of the best parts of themselves, the compassion they aspired to live by, the humanity they carried home from service and sometimes struggled to protect. The community noticed the change as well. There was a lightness about her now, a steadiness that came from knowing she was not alone. People listened more closely when she spoke. They asked questions. They saw her not as someone who endured quietly, but as someone whose life carried meaning. Her story spread, not as gossip, but as inspiration, a reminder that goodness often moves unseen, but it does not disappear. What lingered most strongly was the shared understanding that healing doesn't always come immediately. Sometimes it takes decades. Sometimes it arrives only after we've learned to live without expecting it. For all of them, the reunion didn't erase the past, but it reframed it. Pain no longer stood alone, it was balanced by purpose. In the end, the emotional aftermath wasn't loud or dramatic. It was gentle, lasting, and real. It lived in quieter nights, easier breaths, and the knowledge that something once broken had been made whole again, not just a van on the side of the road, but lives connected by a kindness that refused to fade. It's easy to believe that only big actions change the world, that impact must be loud, public, and immediate to matter. But this story quietly dismantles that idea. What happened on the side of the road in 1983 was not a grand gesture. There was no audience, no recognition, and no guarantee that the effort would lead to anything meaningful. And yet, that single decision, to stop, to listen, to help, outlived decades of hardship and distance. It became proof that small kindnesses, offered sincerely, can carry a weight far beyond the moment they're given. Kindness often works in silence. It doesn't announce itself or demand repayment. It simply enters someone's life at a vulnerable moment and leaves behind something lasting: hope, dignity, or the strength to keep going. For the four veterans, that roadside help became a reminder that they were still worthy of care when the world seemed to have moved on without them. That feeling stayed, shaping how they treated others, how they measured success, and how they understood responsibility. For the woman, kindness was never strategy or a transaction. It was a reflex built from years of living with empathy despite scarcity. She helped because she could, not because she expected anything in return. That purity is what gave her action such power. It carried no conditions, no judgment, and no expectation. And when kindness is given that freely, it has room to grow on its own, beyond the control or awareness of the person who offers it. What makes small acts of compassion so powerful is their unpredictability. We rarely know who truly needs us in a given moment or how close someone might be to giving up. A pause, a word, a hand offered can interrupt despair in ways no grand solution ever could. The woman had no way of knowing the internal battles those men were fighting, just as they had no way of knowing the struggles she carried home with her that night. Yet kindness bridged that gap effortlessly. This story also reminds us that kindness is never wasted, even when it seems to disappear. Time may delay its return, but it doesn't erase it. The world has a way of storing these moments, allowing them to resurface when meaning has ripened and understanding has deepened. What felt like a loss to her at the time, money spent, time lost, was never truly lost. It was simply waiting. In a world that often celebrates speed, strength, and self-interest, stories like this ask us to slow down and look again. They challenge us to see value in patience, empathy, and quiet courage. Because the truth is, we may never witness the full impact of our kindness, but that doesn't mean it isn't shaping someone's life in profound ways. Small kindnesses matter because they remind us of who we are capable of being. And sometimes, decades later, they come back to remind us that they mattered all along. This story is not only about a woman who stopped to help, but also about 4 veterans who carried the weight of service long after their uniforms were folded away. Their journey reflects a reality shared by many who return home from war, applause fades, routines resume, and the world expects them to simply adjust. But service leaves marks that aren't always visible. It shapes how people see danger, trust, and belonging. For these men, the broken van was more than a mechanical failure. It was a moment where the vulnerability they carried inside became visible to the world. Veterans often move through society quietly, their sacrifices acknowledged in words but overlooked in action. They carry discipline, resilience, and loyalty into civilian life, yet frequently struggle to find the same sense of purpose they once had. The kindness shown to these 4 men mattered because it treated them not as problems to avoid or symbols to admire, but as people. It met them at eye level, without ceremony or judgment. That simple respect restored something essential that service alone could not guarantee. At the same time, the woman in this story represents a different kind of hero, one without rank, recognition, or reward. She didn't wear a uniform or receive a medal, yet her actions required courage just as real. Unsung heroes are everywhere, people who step in when it's inconvenient, who give even when resources are scarce, and who do the right thing without expecting their names to be remembered. They form the quiet backbone of humanity, holding it together through moments no one documents. What connects veterans and everyday heroes is a shared willingness to act when it matters. Both answer calls that don't come with certainty or applause. Both accept risk, emotional, physical, or financial, because they believe something greater is at stake. In this story, their paths crossed briefly, yet the impact was lifelong. One act of compassion met a lifetime of service, and together they created a legacy that neither could have formed alone. Honoring veterans means more than ceremonies and holidays. It means recognizing their humanity, understanding their struggles, and meeting them with the same dignity they once extended to others. Honoring unsung heroes means telling their stories, even when they never asked for them to be told. It means acknowledging that the world is often held together by people whose names never appear in headlines. This story reminds us that heroism doesn't always look the way we expect. Sometimes it stands by the roadside, holding a decision in its hands. Sometimes it waits quietly for decades, carrying gratitude until the time is right to return it. And sometimes, true honor is found not in recognition, but in remembering. There is a quiet question at the heart of this story, one that lingers long after the details fade. What would we do in that moment? Not in a crisis that makes headlines, but in an ordinary interruption that asks us to choose between convenience and compassion. The woman in this story didn't set out to change lives. She simply responded to what was in front of her. And that is the first lesson. Impact doesn't require foresight, only presence. We often underestimate the power of showing up. A kind word, a pause, a willingness to help can become an anchor for someone else's survival, even if we never see the result. The veterans didn't need her to fix everything. They needed to be seen and supported when they were stranded and vulnerable. The lesson is clear. We don't have to solve someone's entire life to make a meaningful difference. Sometimes, helping them through one moment is enough. Another lesson is patience. The return on kindness is rarely immediate, and expecting it can cheapen the act itself. The woman went decades without knowing whether her choice mattered, yet her integrity remained intact because she never measured goodness by reward. This challenges us to act with sincerity even when the world seems indifferent. What we give freely often finds its way back, not always in the form we expect, and not always when we're watching. The story also invites reflection on gratitude. The veterans could have remembered and moved on. Instead, they allowed gratitude to mature into action. They teach us that appreciation becomes meaningful when it is expressed, when it closes a circle rather than leaving it open. Gratitude, like kindness, grows stronger when shared. Finally, this story reminds us that no one is as invisible as they feel. The woman believed her life had gone unnoticed, that her sacrifices blended into the background of time. She was wrong, her actions mattered, her character mattered, and so does ours. Every choice we make, especially the quiet ones, adds to a story we may never fully see. As viewers, the lesson is not to wait for a perfect moment or grand opportunity. It is to recognize that meaning is already present in our daily lives, waiting for us to respond. The road we're traveling today may become someone else's turning point tomorrow. As this story comes to a close, what lingers isn't the passage of time or the surprise of reunion, but the quiet truth beneath it all, that life is shaped far more by who we choose to be than by what we manage to achieve. A single moment on the side of a road in 1983 became a thread that stitched together decades of struggle, resilience, and gratitude, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was sincere. The woman never saw herself as important, the veterans never imagined they would return, yet life, in its own patient way, brought meaning full circle. It reminds us that our smallest decisions often carry the greatest weight, even when we walk away believing they're finished. Nothing truly good is ever wasted. It waits, it grows, and sometimes it comes back to remind us why it mattered in the first place. As you step away from this story, carry that thought with you. Somewhere, someone may need the very kindness you're capable of giving today. And years from now, that moment may become part of a story bigger than you ever expected. Thank you for spending this time with us and for allowing this journey to unfold. Until the next story, this is Swift Tale, reminding you that compassion doesn't have an expiration date, and neither does hope.